Hey guys, in this video we're going to be looking at chapter 10 of the Ecce textbook titled Departure. In the story for this chapter, the family is going to be getting ready to go to Rome, and you're going to meet a new family slave named Geta. The grammar for this chapter is really important as you're going to be learning another use of the infinitive, and you're going to be learning an idea called conjugation, which is the verb equivalent of a declension. Again, this is a really important and foundational part of Latin, so you really want to pay attention to this. To start, we're going to be looking at Chapter 10's vocabulary, and specifically, we're going to be looking at the derivatives that relate to our daily life in English. The first word we want to look at is alias, which means another. And from this word in English, we get the derivatives alias, alibi, and alien. And if you think about their definitions, all three of these words mean another or something other than our own. So if you think of an alien, that's someone who's different from you. If you think of an alias, it's another name that you use to try to hide from the police, for instance. Again, they all come back to this word for other or another. The word ponere means to put or to place in Latin. And in English, we get a lot of derivatives from this. Too many to list out here, but I'll give you a few just so you get a sense of it. So the English derivatives include words like component, opponent, depot, preposition, postpone, juxtaposition, and position. And if you think about it, they all relate to that root of putting or placing something. So if you think of a depot, that's a place where different materials are stored or put. Think of the word position and juxtaposition. They're all holding on to the same meaning. The phrase in itinere means on a journey in Latin. And from the itinere part, we get itinerary in English. And if you think about it, it makes sense because an itinerary has to do with you taking a trip. It's sort of the outline of what your trip will be. And it's coming from this phrase that means to go on a journey. The verb solere shows up in our book in the phrase gerere solent, which means they are accustomed to wearing. And specifically, the solere part has to do with being accustomed. And in English, it gives us the derivatives insolent and obsolete. And if you think about it, if you're insolent, it means you're someone who doesn't follow customs or customary behavior. So in other words, you're rude. But you can see it's got that meaning of accustomed or customs right within it. So it's holding on to that base. Stat means he or she stands. And in English, we get the words stable, state, stature, establish, and statue. And if you think of their definitions, all five have to do with standing. So a statue, for instance, is something that's standing up. Your stature is talking about how you stand or how you appear to someone else. They all have to do with standing. Via in Latin means road, and it comes to us in English with the derivative via, which means the exact same thing. We also get deviate, voyage, and trivia. Now, if you think of the word trivia, it's usually a competition where there's a bunch of different answers that might be correct, and you're guessing which is right. It literally in Latin means three ways, tri, via. And what it's talking about is a scenario where you have different options of which way to go. That's the same idea as a multiple choice trivia question. So again, all four of these are holding on to the root of a road. Habet means he or she holds in Latin. And from this we get inhabit, inhibit, exhibit, and habitat. And all four are coming back to this idea of having or holding something. Cross in Latin means tomorrow. And one of the basic English derivatives we get from this is procrastinate, which, if you know the meaning of that word, it means to put off until tomorrow. So it makes sense that it has the word tomorrow right within it. It means he or she urges on or spurs on in Latin, and it leads us to the English derivative of incite, which has the same meaning. So if you think of someone inciting a group of people or inciting a riot, it means they're urging it on or trying to start it. And it comes from this exact same word in Latin, incitat, he or she urges on. Jacet means he or she throws in Latin. And from this we get English words such as adjective, interject, eject, object, and trajectory. And if you think about it, they all have to do with throwing something. So if you're ejected, it means you're thrown out of something. And if you think of the trajectory of, say, a baseball, for instance, it's been hit and it's up in the air. You're tracking its motion. It's been thrown is another way of thinking about it. That's where the word trajectory comes from. Equus in Latin is the word for horse, and in English we get the words equestrian and equine. And if you think back to an earlier video, I told you that in English, whenever there's two ways of saying something, usually the simpler version is the German, and the more scientific or fancy version is the Latin. That's the case here. The simpler version would be to call the animal a horse, but the scientific term for it would be equine, relating to horses. And people who ride horses are called equestrians, and you can see the root for horse right. The grammar for Chapter 10 is the accusative and infinitive construction. And for this, we're going to be drawing back on our knowledge of infinitives and seeing how they can actually take a direct object, which of course will be in the accusative case. So just a quick recap. You want to remember that the infinitive in Latin is a form of a verb that does not have a person. So in other words, there's no he, she, or it. So we translate the infinitive as to do something. And we can always identify the infinitive by its re ending in Latin. In many Latin sentences, the infinitive can actually take a direct object. So let's look at an example sentence. Ancillam iubet alias tunicas incistam ponere, which means he or she orders the slave woman to put the other tunics in the chest. So the first thing we want to do here is mark it up for its core elements. And to start, we're looking for the main verb, the verb that's not in the infinitive. And we can find it here with iubet, which means he or she orders. Since it's our main verb, we mark it with a V. Next, though, we have to figure out whether this is a transitive or an intransitive verb. So we're looking for a direct object that might go with it. And to do this, we ask our question, he or she orders who, or he or she orders what? The answer should be a direct object. The first pair of words we notice that's in the accusative is alias tunicas. But if you think about it, this doesn't quite make sense in English. You wouldn't say he or she is ordering the other tunics, because why would you order an inanimate object? That doesn't make any sense. Another option is incistam, and we notice that kistam ends in an am, which is our accusative singular in the first declension. The problem with this, though, is that incistam is a prepositional phrase, and we learned last chapter that prepositional phrases can never be direct objects. So this won't work either. The only option we have left is ancillam, the slave woman, and it makes sense. It ends in am, which is a first declension accusative singular ending. This is our direct object. You're saying he or she orders who? The slave woman. So we mark it with a do. Now we know that iubet is a transitive verb, since it's taking a direct object. And you want to remember that the verb iubet is often followed by an infinitive, because you're answering the question, he or she orders blank, the direct object, to do what? And that last part of to do what will be the infinitive. In this case, the infinitive is ponere, which we recognize with the re ending. You're saying he or she orders the slave woman to do what? To place. So we mark ponere with an inf to show that it's the infinitive of our sentence. Now, though, we can ask one more question. We can say he or she orders the slave woman to put what? In other words, we're looking for one more direct object. This direct object, though, is not going with iubet, it's going with ponere, to put what? Here is where alias tunicas comes into play. It has the accusative plural ending, so we know it can be a direct object. And here it actually makes sense to say, he orders the slave woman to put the other tunics. It answers the question, to put what? So we mark it with a direct object, and now we've completed marking our core elements. And you can notice that the first direct object is going with iubet. He orders or she orders the slave woman. The second direct object is going with ponere. So here, alias tunicas is going with the infinitive, to place the other tunics. This is what we mean by the accusative and infinitive construction. So just a quick recap. The first thing you want to do in these sentences is find the subject and the main verb, meaning the verb that's not in the infinitive. Once you have that, you want to find the direct object that goes with that main verb. Again, you're looking for the accusative case. Then you want to find the infinitive verb. It'll be a different verb in the infinitive, so you're looking for that re ending. And last, you want to find the direct object that goes with the infinitive. This will be a second direct object that does not go with the main verb. It can only be going with the infinitive. The next thing we want to talk about are conjugations. And what you'll notice as we move through this part of the chapter, which is extremely important for Latin, is that it should remind you of declensions when we're talking about nouns and adjectives. At its core, conjugations are all about grouping verbs. We're trying to take all the verbs that there are in Latin and figure out a way to put them into specific groups. So just a quick recap. You want to think back and remember that in Latin we put nouns and adjectives into groups that we call declensions. That's going to be really important here. So if you think of our chart, so far we've seen 3 different groups or 3 different declensions. And it's the endings that go with all of our cases, the nominative, accusative, ablative, and vocative. This chart helps us organize our endings and understand how we're spelling Latin nouns and adjectives. Just like declensions, we also put Latin verbs into categories, but we call these conjugations. The idea is the same though, we're trying to organize verbs into different groups. These conjugations have fixed endings, meaning that if you know what conjugation a verb belongs to, you can predict all of its endings. That's a really important idea in Latin. There are 4 conjugations in Latin, and verbs belong to a conjugation based on their infinitive endings. You want to remember, the infinitive ending is the form of the verb that ends in re, and it's translated to do something. The 4 infinitive endings in Latin are are, long ere, short ere, and ire. So for instance, you might have a verb laudare, which means to praise, or habere, which means to have, repellere, to repel, and audire, to hear. Notice the endings on all 4 of these verbs. They're all a little bit different. They each have the re, which we recognize as being the infinitive, but the vowel that goes in front of that re is different in every case. It's either a long A, a long E, a short E, or a long I. Now you know how to quickly identify a verb based on its infinitive form. So let's take a look at these 4 verbs: ascendere, ridere, nescire, and curare. Look at the endings. They're short ere, long ire, long ire, and a long are. This will help us identify them quickly. So now we know the first has to be third. It's a short ere, ascendere. The second, ridere, has a long e. This is the second conjugation. Nescire has a long ire. We recognize this as fourth. And curare has a long are. This is the first conjugation. Again, you're looking at the endings of these infinitives to figure out what group they belong to. Whenever you see a Latin verb listed in the dictionary or in your textbook, the entry is going to have a few different pieces. So for instance, if you had the verb laudare, it would be listed like this: laudo, laudare. The first part is what we call the first principal part. Laudo is the first person singular, meaning I praise. The second part, or the second principal part, will always be the infinitive. So laudare means to praise. This is the infinitive form. And it's important to mark this because your book is giving you the infinitive to show you what conjugation the verb belongs to. So the reason you're seeing laudo, laudare here is 1, to show you how to spell the first person, laudo, and 2, it's giving the infinitive to tell you what conjugation this verb belongs to. In this case, laudare belongs to the first conjugation because it has that are ending. Now that we can identify conjugations quickly and easily, we want to start applying what we already know about verb endings in order to conjugate verbs. And what we mean by conjugating a verb is taking it and putting it into its different persons. So first person, second person, third person, singular and plural. So here are some quick steps to conjugating a verb. First, you want to take the infinitive form and drop the re. This is called the present stem. So for instance, let's take laudare. We recognize the re at the end. We want to cut that off. When you do that, you're left with lauda. This is the present stem. You should recognize this because it's also the imperative. They're the exact same thing. But for what we're doing now, you want to think of this as the present stem. The next thing we want to do is add our personal endings, which you remember as OST, MUSTIS, NT. Remember, your book is going to list the first two principal parts for you. So the first principal part is always the first person singular present. So laudo means I praise. We would get this by bringing down that O ending and attaching it to our present stem. So laudo is I praise. For the others though, we're taking the present stem and just adding our endings. So if we add an we get laudas, which means you praise. If we add a T, we have laudat. Laudamus, laudatus, and finally laudant, they praise. So you can see all you're doing is adding the personal verb endings to this present stem. In the third conjugation, there's a subset of verbs that have a slightly different ending. We call these third IO verbs, and the reason we call them this is because their first principal part ends in IO. So for instance, yakio, yakare, which means I throw and to throw. You'll notice the short ERE ending in the infinitive is telling you it's a third conjugation verb. But look at that first principal part. There's an IO there. This is the red flag to you that something is slightly different. Whenever you see a third conjugation verb and the first principal part ends in IO, take notes. In the next couple slides, you're going to see exactly how they're different from regular third conjugations. So let's look at our chart of verb endings. The first thing you want to notice is that we've broken these up into their conjugations. And again, the conjugations are based off the infinitive. So you'll notice here in blue, the infinitive endings are marked. First conjugation, ARE, second is long ERE, third, short ERE, and fourth is IRE. You always want to look at the infinitive to figure out the conjugation. Next, we want to look at the first and second conjugation. And you'll notice that the way we got this spelling of all the verb forms is from going to the infinitive, dropping the RE to get our present stem, and then adding our endings. That's where we get the spellings of paras, parat, paramus. It's taking that stem of para and just adding our verb endings. The only place this is different is in the first person singular. And remember, that will be given to you in that first principal part. So you always want to be paying attention for it. The same goes for the second conjugation. All we've done is gone to the infinitive, dropped the RE, and added our endings. In the third conjugation, you want to look at the difference between the column on the left and the column on the right. This is where IO verbs comes back into play. If you notice, on the left with mito, there's no I in that spelling. The ending is just a simple O. On the right-hand side, with yakare, we've added an I. The first person singular is yakio. This is what's showing you that it's a third conjugation IO. It's literally ending in the letters IO. Now we want to look at the rest of the third conjugation, and you'll notice something different happening here with the spelling. So if we were to take the infinitive mitere, for instance, and try to find the present stem, you might think that we would just drop the RE and we'd be left with M-I-T-T-E. That makes sense, except look at the way the verbs are spelled. In the second person singular, it's M-I-T-T-I-S. Something has happened here. So the change you want to take a note on is that in the third conjugation, we switch that stem vowel from an E to an I. So in other words, it's not going to be M-I-T-T-E-S, it's going to be M-I-T-T-I-S. And that goes for the entire third conjugation, including the IOs. Now let's take a look at the last change in the third conjugation. In the third person plural, you'll notice stem vowel has changed again. So look at the left-hand column. Instead of M-I-T-T-I-N-T, there's a U there. This is the last change. In the third person plural, the stem vowel will flip from an I to a U. This is where we get the word mitunt, or they send, from. Now let's look at the IO column one more time. On the right-hand side, you'll see that Instead of jakunt with a unt ending, there's another I slipped in there. It's jakiunt. This again is what we mean by IO verbs. In the third person plural, we're putting that I back in. So instead of jakunt, it's jakiunt. The last thing you want to notice on this chart is in the fourth conjugation. Look at how the third person plural is spelled. Just like with the third conjugation, the fourth conjugation will also put a U there. So instead of audint, A-U-D-I-N-T, we're putting in a U to make audiunt. This is a rule for the fourth conjugation. In the third person plural, there's always a U before the NT. And again, the one thing you might get tripped up on here is distinguishing between second and third conjugation. And the key here is to look at the vowels. In the second conjugation, it's ending in a long ERE, habere. In the third conjugation, it's ending with a short ERE, mittere. You have to pay attention to those long vowels and keep track of them in your book. This will help you distinguish between second and third conjugation. So let's take an example, excipio excipere. The first thing we notice is that the infinitive ends in a short ERE. This is telling us it's a third conjugation verb. So the next question is it an IO verb? And the answer here is yes. We can tell because the first principal part ends in IO, excipio. Now we know what endings we need. It's a third conjugation IO verb. So the first thing we do is we start with the first principal part, excipio, and we bring that down into our list. And now from there, we can use the rules we just learned of endings and third conjugation spelling, and we can conjugate the rest of the verb. It will go excipio, excipis, excipit, excipimus, excipitus, excipiunt. And again, remember, since it's a third conjugation verb, that last one, excipiunt, has a UNT. And since it's a third conjugation IO, we're sticking that I there as well. So it ends in an IUNT. Everything else is exactly what we learned. You take the present stem, you flip the stem vowel from an E to an I because it's third conjugation, and we're adding our ending. The last thing we want to talk about in this chapter is the imperative mood. And this is something that has to do with verbs again. And we mentioned it before when I talked about the present stem. We're going to go into it in more detail now. The imperative mood is used when you're issuing orders or giving commands. The term imperative is actually still used in English, and it's holding on to the same meaning. So if you just say to someone it's imperative that you do this, you're almost ordering them to do it. It has that same meaning in English as in the Latin. So for instance, if you were to say to someone, go to your room, the verb go here is in the imperative mood. You're ordering someone to do that. You're telling them go. And you'll notice there's no person attached to it. You're not saying I go, or you go, or he goes. You're just saying go. It's that order or command. That's what we call the imperative. In Latin, we distinguish between a singular command, meaning you're telling one person to do something, and a plural command, meaning you're telling a group of people to do something. We don't do this in English. In English, it's the exact same word, no matter how many people you're talking to. So just pay attention to this in Latin because it's something slightly different than what you're used to. To form the singular positive imperative, meaning that you're ordering one person to do something, you simply go to the infinitive of the verb and drop the re. So for instance, let's take an example of parare, which means to prepare. If we were to drop the re, we would get para, which means prepare in Latin. And again, you'll notice para is also the present stem that we just learned with conjugations. It's the exact same thing. Para means prepare, and it's singular, meaning you're telling one person to prepare something. To make it plural, and also a positive imperative, you have to take the singular form and add a te. So if our singular positive imperative is para, that means our plural positive imperative will be parate. You're adding a te. In English, it means the same thing, prepare, because we can't make a distinction between singular and plural. But in Latin, if it's parate, it means you're telling a group of people to prepare something. It's a plural form of the imperative. To form the singular negative imperative, meaning you're telling one person not to do something, you have to put the word noli in front of the infinitive. And now you're issuing a negative command. So let's take the verb parare again. To make it negative, we would add noli. Now instead of prepare, you're saying don't prepare. You're telling one person to not do something. To form the plural negative imperative, you add the word nolite in front of the infinitive. So again, let's take our example. Parare means prepare. Nolite parare means don't prepare. So again, you're giving that negative plural command. You're telling a group of people not to do something. So let's look at a chart of the imperative mood. So if we have our 4 conjugations again, now you can see the spelling of the different imperatives. And you'll notice that the only difference here, the only thing you want to take note of, is in the 3rd conjugation. If you look at the singular positive command, for instance, mittere, send, what we've done in the singular positive is we've dropped the re to get mite. In the plural, though, instead of just adding a te, we've switched the e to an I. This is something you want to remember from when we did conjugations, changing that stem vowel from an e to an I. You're doing the exact same thing in the imperative, so you always want to take note of that. Just do a quick recap. These are the for forming the imperative. In the positive singular, you're going to drop the re off of the infinitive form of the verb. For the positive plural, you're going to add a te to the singular positive imperative. And remember, in the 3rd conjugation, you have to switch the stem vowel from an e to an I in front of that te ending. For the negative singular, you're going to insert noli in front of the infinitive form. And for the negative plural, you're inserting nolite in front of the infinitive form. Keep this in mind, try to make sense of it. It sounds a little more complicated than it actually is, and the best way to make sense of all this is through practice. And remember, the key to understanding imperatives starts with conjugations.